They called her Hurrem, the cheerful one. But history remembers her by many other names. To some, she was the saint who fed the poor. To others, the serpent who whispered princes into their graves. She came to this palace in chains, a nameless girl torn from her homeland. And from behind a veil, she bent an empire to her will. Her smile could save a life, or end it. Her love could build a dynasty, or destroy it. And her ambition would stain the marble of these halls forever. This is not just the story of a queen. This is the story of a slave who learned to rule, and of the price the world paid for her crown. This is the story of a beautiful queen, Hurrem Sultan. The air was heavy with the damp salt of the Bosphorus, clinging to skin like an unshakable memory. Constantinople's slave market writhed with movement, merchants calling in a dozen tongues, horses stamping in protest against the cold, and the slow shuffling of human feet bound in iron. The rain fell in fine, needling strands, turning the dust beneath into mud that swallowed footprints whole. Among the frightened captives stood a young girl from the far Ruthenian steppes. Barefoot, her skin chafed red from the shackles, she held herself unnaturally still, as though stillness might render her invisible. But her eyes betrayed her. Wide, unblinking, they reflected the fire of the braziers and the faces of men who saw her not as a human, but as a prize to be weighed, inspected, and bought. She had been taken months earlier, torn from a land of snow and timber smoke. The night the raiders came, her village had been nothing but muffled shouts and the hiss of thatch catching fire. Her mother's voice, the last she would hear, was lost in the chaos. She remembered the smell of burning wool, the hot taste of blood from biting her own lip, the rope biting her wrists. The road south was long, and the caravan was cruel. Those who stumbled were left for the crows. Now she stood here, another nameless face in the empire's endless appetite for bodies. The man who purchased her was no merchant of grain or silk, but an agent of the palace, his robes clean despite the filth around him, his coin purse heavy. Her name was Alexandra once. Now she would be called Hurrem, the cheerful one. A cruel joke whispered in a language not her own. The journey to Topkapi Palace was not long, but it was silent. Even the clatter of hooves seemed muted beneath the weight of what awaited. The palace walls loomed pale and damp against the gray sky, their massive gates swallowing all light as she passed through. Inside, the harem was not the den of pleasure whispered of in foreign lands, but a fortress within a fortress. Long corridors muffled sound with thick carpets. The scent of rosewater hung heavy in the air, clinging to every breath, masking, but not erasing, the faint undertone of fear. Women's voices murmured in a dozen accents, each voice measured, each laugh calculated. They did not look at her with pity. In their eyes, she was not a sister in suffering, but another rival, another mouth to feed, another beauty to compete with. Hurrem learned quickly. In the harem, beauty was a weapon, but silence was survival. She studied the older concubines, how they moved with deliberate grace, how they spoke little but said much with their eyes. She memorized the layout of the palace wing, the timing of the eunuchs' patrols, the way servants bowed deeper to certain women than others. She listened, she absorbed, she adapted. The food was strange, honeyed meats, rice steamed with saffron, sherbets sweet enough to hurt the teeth. The fabrics were rich, silks that whispered against the skin, brocades heavy as armor. But the walls were higher than any fortress she had known, and the locks on the doors were meant not to keep danger out, but to keep the women in. At night, she lay awake beneath embroidered ceilings, the rain's rhythm replaced by the faint hum of the Bosphorus beyond the gardens. She wondered about the man whose will governed this place. Suleiman, Padishah, shadow of God on earth. She had never seen him, but his presence was felt in every corridor, in every bowed head. It was said he could make or break a life with a glance. And Hurrem began to think that perhaps a glance was all she needed. The chance came sooner than she expected. One spring morning, the harem was summoned to the gardens to greet the Sultan as he returned from the divan. She dressed as the others did, in layered silks, her hair perfumed and braided, but she hid something in her expression that they did not: intention. When the Sultan entered, the air seemed to thicken. His robe was the deep blue of a storm at sea, his turban white as bone. The women lowered their eyes, as was custom. But Hurrem, standing at the back, allowed hers to rise, just slightly, just enough. Their eyes met for no more than a heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, she did not offer shyness nor fear. She offered a smile. It was not the soft smile of a girl grateful to be noticed, nor the coy smile of practiced seduction. It was a smile that hinted at knowledge, as if she already knew how this story would end, and that his role was already written. Suleiman's gaze lingered for the briefest second before he moved on. But in that second, something had shifted. That night, as the harem settled into uneasy sleep, Hurrem stared at the carved beams above her bed. Her mind was already moving, calculating. She did not yet know how she would reach the Sultan's side, but she knew that when she did, she would not squander the moment. The rain had stopped outside. The sky was clear. And somewhere beyond these walls, in the great private chambers of the palace, the ruler of half the known world might just be thinking of the slave who smiled when she should have bowed. And so, beneath the silks and the silence, the first move in a dangerous game had been made, one that would unravel alliances, topple traditions, and bleed an empire from within. It began, as most revolutions do, quietly. The day after the garden encounter, nothing outward had changed. Hurrem still shared her quarters with other concubines, still bathed in the same scented water, still bowed before the same eunuchs. Yet something in the air had altered, imperceptible to most, but to her, sharp as a drawn blade. She had been seen, and in the imperial court, to be seen by the Sultan was not merely to exist. It was to be weighed, measured, and considered. The summons came weeks later. A eunuch appeared at her door in the pale blue of the pre-dawn hour, his face unreadable, his voice a monotone. She was to present herself in the Sultan's private chambers. The air in those rooms was different from the rest of the palace, cooler, perfumed faintly with sandalwood and ink. Scrolls lay open on low tables, maps marked with red pins. This was not the realm of silks and song, but the beating heart of the empire's mind. Suleiman sat not on a throne but on a simple divan, robe loose, turban set aside. His gaze lifted as she entered, and there it was again. That brief, measuring pause. "Your name," he said, though he surely knew it. She replied softly, "Hurrem." The corner of his mouth moved as if amused at the irony. He spoke little that first night. He asked her about her homeland, her language, the winters in Ruthenia. She answered, her words careful but not timid. When she laughed, an unguarded sound, bright against the subdued light. It seemed to linger in the rafters. The next morning, she returned to the harem, but now eyes followed her differently. Her visits to the Sultan's chambers became more frequent. At first, she was called for evenings, to sing, to play the lute, to distract him from the burdens of state. But soon, her presence bled into the daylight hours. She was there when he broke his fast, there when foreign envoys brought letters sealed with wax, there when the divan ended and the Sultan walked the gardens in thought. She asked questions no concubine dared to ask, about campaigns, about treaties, about the laws that governed the empire's distant provinces. She did not flatter blindly, she debated with him. And Suleiman, who had been raised among sycophants and strategists, found her frankness intoxicating. The harem did not take kindly to her ascent. At first, it was small, an earring missing from her jewelry box, a favored scarf misplaced. Then came the gifts, trays of sugared figs, warm bread with honey, left by unknown hands. Hurrem was not naive. She fed the food to the cats in the courtyard and waited. By morning, 2 were dead. Servants whispered as she passed. Not her given name, never her given name, always the Ruthenian, or with a hiss of contempt, the smiling snake. But jealousy was only dangerous if one allowed it to wound. Harem wore their hatred like another piece of jewelry, weighty but valuable. If they loathed her, it meant she was a threat. And in the palace, to be a threat was safer than to be forgotten. Sulayman's reliance on her grew. When petitions from distant governors arrived, he sometimes asked her opinion before consulting his viziers. When a marriage alliance was proposed, he wondered aloud what Hurrem thought of the foreign court's loyalty. In matters of war, she did not give orders, not directly, but she posed questions that lingered in his mind. Is it not better to weaken your enemy's allies before striking the enemy himself? She once asked, tracing the edge of a map with her finger. The following week, a planned campaign shifted focus entirely. It was unprecedented. Never before had a woman of the harem, much less one who had entered in chains, influenced imperial policy so openly. The Grand Vizier observed quietly, his eyes narrowing in calculation. The Valide Sultan, Sulayman's mother, began to appear in the harem more often, her gaze on Hurrem long and assessing. Hurrem understood the danger. She had climbed quickly, but quick ascents were often followed by quicker falls. And yet, she could not step back. The higher she rose, the more clearly she could see the future. And in that future, she was not merely a favorite. She was indispensable. But indispensability is a double-edged sword. The same qualities that made her valuable to Sulayman made her dangerous to everyone else. The concubines saw her as the destroyer of their own ambitions. The viziers saw her as an unpredictable influence on the Sultan's decisions. And in an empire where power was as intoxicating as wine, whispers could be as deadly as swords. One evening, as she left the Sultan's chambers, she found a strip of silk tied to her door handle. It was embroidered with the shape of a scorpion, a warning, or perhaps a prophecy. She untied it slowly, her face impassive. Inside her, however, something shifted. She had crossed the threshold from favored consort to political figure. From now on, every step she took would be watched, and every smile could be mistaken for a strike. Still, she rose. The Sultan began to keep her at his side, even in audiences with ambassadors, under the pretense of her serving sherbet or translating a phrase. She learned the faces of the men who ruled Europe's courts, the way their eyes darted toward her before returning to Sulayman. Some mistook her for ornament, others suspected the truth. In quiet moments, Sulayman would speak to her not as a master to a concubine, but as one sovereign might speak to another. And yet, somewhere in the back of his mind, and in the whispers of the palace, a question began to grow. Was Hurrem Sultan his greatest love, or his most dangerous weakness? It was a question that would not fade, and as it echoed in the gilded halls of Topkapi, it began to shape the fate of princes, the course of wars, and the very future of the Ottoman throne. The next move in this silent war would change not just the palace, but the empire itself. The decision came like lightning from a clear sky. No one in the palace, not the Grand Vizier, not the Valide Sultan, not the oldest eunuch, had expected it. The Sultan had taken favorites before, favorites who had charmed him, entertained him, even borne his children. But they always remained what they were, concubines bound by tradition, dismissed when their beauty faded. Suleiman broke that tradition with a single stroke of the pen. Hurrem, once a Ruthenian slave brought through the harem gates in chains, was to be his lawful wife. The announcement spread through the palace like fire on dry grass. In the kitchens, scullions stopped mid-chop to whisper. In the barracks, janissaries exchanged knowing smirks, not all of them approving. And in the harem, disbelief turned quickly to fury. Silk-slippered feet paced the corridors. Voices rose in indignation. To the women who had spent years sharpening themselves into perfect instruments of seduction, the message was clear. The game was over, and Hurrem had won. The wedding itself was both lavish and intimate, a paradox befitting the union. The palace gardens were hung with banners of crimson and gold. The scent of rosewater filled the air, mingling with the tang of fresh-cut cypress. Musicians played from shaded alcoves, while trays of sherbet and candied fruits glistened under the sun. And there, seated beside Suleiman in a robe of deep emerald, her veil thin enough to reveal the unflinching curve of her smile, was Hurrem, now Haseki Sultan, the favored consort, with a legal claim no other woman in the harem could match. The act was more than love. It was a declaration of war against centuries of custom. No sultan had married a concubine in living memory, and certainly not one taken from the slave markets. The marriage bound her to him, not only in his private chambers, but in the affairs of the state. It gave her a formal voice, a recognized position, and a permanence that no whisper of scandal could unseat. It also placed her directly in the crosshairs of every man and woman who resented her growing influence. The births came quickly. First a son, then another, and another. Each one a potential heir to the Ottoman throne. Each one another stone in the fortress of Hurrem's power. In the ancient, merciless logic of the dynasty, these sons were not just children. They were weapons. And Hurrem understood that to keep them alive, she would have to control every thread of the empire's web. She began to build her image as a mother of the people. Mosques rose at her command, their domes glinting in the sunlight. Soup kitchens fed the poor during the long winters, their cauldrons steaming at all hours. Her name was carved into marble fountains, woven into the tiles of bathhouses, embroidered into the hems of ceremonial banners. The city began to speak of her not just as the Sultan's wife, but as a patroness, a woman who brought charity as well as change. For the poor, it was enough to win their loyalty. For the court, it was a strategy too well executed to dismiss. But charity in the palace was never pure. Behind the marble facades and public works, Hurrem wove a quieter, sharper tapestry. Her allies rose, given positions of trust in the harem, in the kitchens, among the clerks who handled imperial correspondence. Those who opposed her were exiled to distant provinces, given governorships far from the center of power, or quietly stripped of influence until they vanished from the record entirely. In the harem, rivals found themselves moved to colder, smaller quarters. Invitations to feasts stopped arriving. The channels of gossip, the lifeblood of palace politics, began to flow in directions Hurrem controlled. Her reach extended beyond the palace walls. Through carefully chosen messengers, she influenced the appointment of governors and judges. She secured alliances with distant provinces by arranging marriages, placing her allies' daughters into powerful households. Even the empire's armies were not untouched by her hand, not in direct command, but in the subtle placement of loyal men into key positions. Her fingerprints began to appear on matters far removed from the embroidery frames and perfumed baths of the harem. To Suleiman, she was still the woman whose laughter broke the stillness of his chambers. But to the empire, she had become something more, and more dangerous. The slave who had once entered Topkapi in chains now moved through its corridors in silk, her robes whispering over marble floors, her veiled smile a cipher no one could read. Yet the higher one climbs in a palace built on ambition, the sharper the knives waiting in the shadows. The first real blood came from an unexpected direction. A noblewoman of the court, a distant relative of the Valide Sultan, had long been a quiet but stubborn opponent of Hurrem's influence. She began to voice her objections too openly, hinting to others that the Sultan's judgment was clouded by his wife's manipulations. One morning, her apartments were found empty. She had been sent to a provincial estate for her health. She never returned. It was a small victory, barely noted in the annals of the court. But those who paid attention understood. Hurrem's rise was no accident, and her survival was no mere fortune. By now, the empire's elite understood they were dealing with more than a royal wife. Hurrem was not content to be the jewel in Sulayman's crown. She was shaping the crown itself. The Grand Vizier began to watch her more closely. The Valide Sultan, though aging, tightened her own network of informants. The harem became a place of cold glances and guarded words, the air thick with the unspoken, knowledge that one woman now held a position no one could challenge without risking their life. And still, she smiled. Her charitable works continued, each one doubling as a reminder of her power. Her sons grew under her protection, their tutors chosen not just for their knowledge, but for their loyalty to her. In public, she remained the devoted wife, the benevolent queen, the mother of princes. In private, she was the architect of a dynasty, one she intended to see survive not just her, but any who dared to oppose her. But in the shadows beyond the harem gates, another figure was rising, one who threatened everything she had built. His name was Mustafa, the Sultan's eldest son by another woman, beloved by the people in the army. To secure her children's future, Hurrem would have to destroy him, and the game she had mastered in silk would soon be played in blood. Hurrem Sultan had learned early that in Topkapi Palace, survival was not about beauty alone. It was about control. Control of information, control of alliances, control of the invisible threads that bound the empire together. Now, as the legal wife of the Sultan, she sat in the center of that web. And like any spider, she knew that the slightest tremor could mean danger or opportunity. Her apartments were no longer the modest rooms given to a concubine. They were chambers of polished marble and deep carpets, with fountains whose water sang softly day and night. But Hurrem understood that walls, however gilded, could not keep out enemies. The harem had always been a battlefield, its weapons hidden in glances, in poisoned cups, in the turning of a key to lock a rival inside. But as Haseki Sultan, the battlefield had widened. Beyond the harem doors lay the court, the Grand Vizier with his iron mind, the ambassadors who smiled in one language and lied in another, the eunuchs who guarded not only doors, but the Sultan's most guarded secrets. She began to move among them with precision. The Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, was a man of imposing height and quiet authority, a childhood friend of Sulayman who had risen to become his right hand. To some, he was untouchable. To Hurrem, he was a man with weaknesses like any other: pride, ambition, and a hunger for influence. She learned his rhythms, his favored phrases, the way he paused before agreeing to a proposal when he had already made up his mind. Through subtle conversations, she began to place her allies in positions where they would serve him and her. She praised his wisdom to the Sultan, then quietly sowed doubts when his advice did not align with her own. The foreign ambassadors, too, became part of her tapestry. Some were eager to flatter her, hoping her influence could sway the Sultan's decisions. Others underestimated her, mistaking her smile for mere ornament. Hurrem played them all with the same careful hand, giving just enough truth to be believed, just enough falsehood to serve her ends. Even the eunuchs, long thought loyal only to the Sultan, found themselves drawn into her circle. They carried her messages, altered the order of audiences, whispered in her ear about which concubine had been meeting with whom. Every move was deliberate, every connection a strand in her growing web. But within this growing sphere of influence, a shadow loomed. Prince Mustafa. He was Sulayman's eldest son by Mahidevran, a rival from Hurrem's earliest days in the harem. Mustafa was handsome, disciplined, and, most dangerously, beloved. The Janissaries adored him. The people saw in him the promise of a golden future. If the Ottoman throne was a jewel, Mustafa was already being polished to wear it. For Hurrem, this was more than rivalry. It was a mortal threat to her sons. The Ottoman tradition was as ruthless as it was unspoken. When a new sultan rose to the throne, his brothers often did not survive to challenge him. If Mustafa became sultan, Hurrem's children would not live to see manhood. The choice before her was clear. If her bloodline was to survive, Mustafa could not. She began cautiously, not with direct accusations. Those would be too easily dismissed, but with whispers. Letters to Sulayman, written in her careful, elegant hand, speaking of rumors she had reluctantly heard. Mentions of unusual visitors to Mustafa's quarters. Gentle questions about his growing rapport with the Janissaries. Each missive was laced with feigned reluctance, the words of a wife concerned for her husband's safety, never the open malice of a rival. "It may be nothing," she would write, "but I could not forgive myself if I did not tell you." In the harem, she turned the women into eyes and ears. Servants who polished floors also polished their memories, repeating fragments of conversations overheard. Concubines, hoping for favor, slipped her the names of messengers who came and went from Mustafa's household. The harem became a hive of informants, each believing they were her most trusted confidant. Hurrem kept their trust alive with rewards, a piece of jewelry here, an extra bolt of silk there, while ensuring none of them knew the full scope of her designs. Outside the harem walls, her influence crept into the Sultan's council. When military campaigns were discussed, she would find ways to draw Sulayman's attention to the potential dangers of disloyal generals, often ones connected to Mustafa's allies. She never commanded. She suggested. Never accused. She questioned. And as the months turned into years, her suggestions began to take root in Sulayman's mind. The tension grew slowly, like a storm building far beyond the horizon. Mustafa, unaware of the tightening net, continued to serve with distinction. Victories in the field made him more popular, his soldiers speaking his name with pride. Hurrem knew this only made her position more urgent. The more loved he became, the harder he would be to strike down without fracturing the empire itself. And so her whispers became sharper, her letters to Sulayman more urgent. She began to frame Mustafa's popularity as a danger, a threat to the Sultan's authority. "The people cheer him," she wrote, "but do they cheer him as your son or as your replacement?" It was a war without banners, fought in candlelit rooms and between the lines of personal correspondence. No swords were drawn, no armies marched. Yet the stakes were as high as any battlefield. The survival of one bloodline meant the destruction of another. By the time Sulayman began to openly question Mustafa's loyalties, Hurrem's web was nearly complete. The Grand Vizier leaned closer to her council than to the princes. Ambassadors knew better than to speak well of Mustafa in her presence. Even the eunuchs who served both men began to distance themselves from the heir apparent. But in a palace built on centuries of intrigue, nothing stayed hidden forever. There were those who saw her hand in the growing divide between father and son. Quiet conversations in the marble corridors began to turn toward dangerous speculation. Was the Sultan's judgment truly his own? Or was it the will of a woman who had come to him as a slave? Hurrem heard these whispers, and she smiled. For in her mind, the question did not matter. What mattered was that the trap was set, and the prey was stepping ever closer to its center. Soon, the moment would come when shadows would give way to action, when a prince beloved by an empire would walk into his father's tent and never walk out again. The campaign against Persia had been grueling. The army had marched for weeks through barren landscapes where the wind scoured the skin and the dust stung the eyes. But now, in the valley where the Sultan's army made camp, it was not the enemy across the mountains that occupied the soldiers' thoughts. It was the summons that had gone out. Prince Mustafa, the heir apparent, the beloved son of Suleiman, had been called to his father's tent. The order came suddenly, and in military camps, sudden orders breed whispers. Mustafa rode in at dawn, his cloak whipped by the cold wind, his horse's breath steaming in the chill. He dismounted with the confidence of a commander adored by his men. The Janissaries, the elite core of the empire, watched him pass with something more than loyalty in their eyes. For many, he was not just a prince. He was the sultan they hoped to follow one day. But among the tents, loyalty could be as dangerous as betrayal. The trap had been woven over years, each thread a whisper, each knot a carefully timed doubt. Hurrem's letters had done their work. Reports of Mustafa's dangerous ambitions had been planted with care. Loyal generals had been portrayed as co-conspirators, and now the moment had come when rumor would be dressed in the garb of treason. Inside the pavilion, Suleiman waited. The Sultan was no longer the young warrior who had taken the throne with fire in his eyes. His beard was streaked with gray. His gaze carried the weight of decades spent holding an empire together. Before him lay the accusation that Mustafa had conspired with the Shah of Persia to seize the throne. Whether Suleiman truly believed it is a question history will never answer. But belief in politics is often less important than certainty, and certainty can be manufactured. Mustafa entered the tent with the deference of a son greeting his father, but also with the composure of a man who knew his worth. He bowed, waiting for his father to speak. The silence stretched. When Suleiman finally spoke, his voice was steady, but it carried the weight of something already decided. "You have betrayed me." The words fell like stones. Mustafa protested. He denied the charges, calling them lies. His voice rose, but there was no desperation in it. Only the wounded pride of a soldier who had given everything to his empire. He swore his loyalty, reminded his father of battles fought, of victories won in his name. But outside, the Janissaries were already turning their faces away. Inside, the executioners waited, their bowstrings hidden in their robes. It happened quickly. The chief executioner stepped forward, bowing deeply, before producing the cord of woven silk. In the Ottoman court, royal blood could not be shed, so death came in silence, with no blade drawn. Mustafa fought as any man would, but the tent was small, the men around him strong. The bowstring tightened around his throat. His breath rasped once, twice, then stopped. His eyes, wide with disbelief, stared upward at the canopy of the tent, as if trying to fix one last image into memory before the world went dark. And then, nothing. The Janissaries stationed outside heard no cry, but they felt the shift. A silence deeper than any before settled over the camp. When the body was carried out, wrapped in a plain shroud, they did not speak. Some looked down at the ground. Others stared into the distance, their jaws set. They had lost not just a commander, but the future they had imagined. News travels differently in an army. It moves faster than a horse can ride, whispered from mouth to ear until it becomes a roar. By nightfall, every soldier in the camp knew. By the next day, so did Istanbul. The city's coffee houses swelled with murmurs of outrage. Merchants shook their heads over their ledgers. Women in the markets muttered blessings for Mustafa's soul. And somewhere in the harem, where the air was perfumed and the floors gleamed, Hurrem Sultan received the news without surprise. She did not gloat, not openly. Her rivals would have expected triumph, but Hurrem understood that victory in the palace was never clean. The death of Mustafa secured her son's positions, but it also marked her in the eyes of the people. They could not see the web she had, woven. They only saw the widow's smile and the prince's grave. Her name began to be cursed in the streets, her image blackened in whispered stories. In the popular imagination, she became the architect of a son's death at his father's hand. Whether that was truth or invention no longer mattered. In politics, perception is reality. Suleiman grieved. There was no mistaking that. In the days after the execution, he withdrew into himself, his council meetings shorter, his words fewer. But grief did not loosen Hurrem's hold. She remained at his side, the steady voice in his ear, the quiet presence at his table. If anything, Mustafa's absence tightened her influence. With the heir removed, the path to the throne for her own sons was clearer than it had ever been. Yet the price was steep. The Janissaries' loyalty had been shaken. They did not revolt, not yet, but the bond between the army and the throne had been weakened. In the provinces, governors who had once spoken Mustafa's name with respect now spoke it as a warning, a ghost haunting the edges of the empire. Hurrem's sons stood closer to the throne than ever before, but they would inherit not just the crown, but the stain of the blood that had cleared their path. History is cruel in its judgments. To some, Mustafa's death was the necessary act of a ruler preserving his reign. To others, it was the senseless murder of a prince whose only crime was being loved too well. But in every telling, Hurrem's shadow stretches across the scene. The silent whisperer, the patient strategist, the woman who had arrived in chains and now shaped the destiny of the empire. But even as she savored her triumph, Hurrem knew the game was not over. The death of one rival only sharpened the hunger of others, and the empire beyond the palace walls was beginning to tremble. Her sons had been spared for now, but the shadows that had claimed Mustafa were still moving, and they were moving closer. With Mustafa gone, the empire entered a new and dangerous season. Hurrem's sons, Selim, Bayezid, and Cihangir, now stood in the inner circle of succession. They were princes of the Ottoman bloodline, sons of the most powerful woman in the palace. But in the Ottoman Empire, brothers were not companions in destiny. They were obstacles. Hurrem knew the rule that was never written, yet carved into the bone of every dynasty. One ascends, the rest fall. She gathered her sons in her private chambers, rooms thick with the scent of amber and myrrh. The curtains were drawn, the marble floor scattered with cushions. Outside, the fountain whispered softly as if eavesdropping on their conversation. She spoke not as a mother, but as a strategist. Her words were measured, her tone free of sentiment. "You will be watched," she told them, "not only by the court, but by the soldiers, the viziers, the people. You must be worthy of their fear, or you will be unworthy of the throne." They listened, though each in his own way. Selim, the eldest, nodded politely, his eyes calm, his posture unthreatening. He had inherited his father's easy charm but lacked his steel. He was pliable, agreeable, traits Hurrem valued, for they meant he could be guided. Bayezid II was different. His eyes burned with a restless fire, his questions came sharp, almost defiant. He was bold, quick-witted, and dangerously independent. Hurrem saw in him echoes of Mustafa, and that resemblance unsettled her. And then there was Cihangir, the youngest, frail, pale-skinned, his body curved by a deformity that no silk could disguise. His eyes were deep pools of melancholy, fixed often on the floor as if he carried a sorrow too heavy for his years. Hurrem loved him fiercely, but she knew the truth. The throne was not his destiny. Beyond these walls, the empire watched the three brothers with hungry eyes. The Janissaries weighed them in silence. Governors listened for their names in courtly conversation. Foreign ambassadors sent coded reports to their kings, speculating on which son might one day inherit the mantle of Suleiman. And in the echo of every whispered name was the shadow of what that inheritance meant. Hurrem's role now was not only to protect her sons from their enemies, it was to protect them from each other. She arranged their education with care, appointing tutors whose loyalty was as important as their scholarship. The palace gardens became classrooms for lessons in statecraft, the tiled chambers, arenas for debates on war and governance, but no lesson could erase the truth each boy carried in his heart. Only one would live to rule. The tension between Selim and Bayezid grew slowly, like rot beneath the surface of polished wood. At dinners, their polite words masked subtle barbs. In council practice, each tried to outshine the other in the Sultan's eyes. Hurrem saw it all. Sometimes she intervened, redirecting conversation, softening rivalry with the illusion of fairness. Other times, she let the hostility breathe, knowing that open conflict was easier to control than the kind that hid in shadows. Cihangir, meanwhile, withdrew further into himself. His health worsened. The court physicians brought powders, syrups, and endless remedies, but nothing seemed to ease his pain. He spent hours alone in his rooms, sketching scenes from memory, the gardens of his childhood, the ships in the Bosphorus, even the faces of his brothers. Hurrem often sat with him in these quiet hours, her hand resting lightly on his. In him, she saw the child she could not protect from the inevitability of the dynasty's cruelty. His survival did not depend on his strength, but on the mercy of whoever wore the crown next. Selim became her favored heir, not for his brilliance, but for his obedience. He understood the value of appearing harmless, a skill Hurrem had once mastered herself. He rarely argued with her counsel, and when he did, it was with deference. Bayezid resisted her guidance. He challenged her strategies, questioned her alliances. His defiance worried her, but it also sparked a grudging respect. He was dangerous not because he was reckless, but because he thought for himself. In another world, she might have been proud. In this one, his independence was a liability she could not afford. The court felt the shifting winds. Rumors began to circulate, some planted, some organic, about Bayezid's impatience, his ambition, his private meetings with officers whose loyalty was suspect. Hurrem did not need to push these whispers. She only needed to let them grow. The Janissaries noticed too. Many saw in Bayezid the warrior spirit they had admired in Mustafa, and that loyalty was both a blessing and a curse. Hurrem knew too well how the army's affection could be turned into an accusation of treason. Suleiman, still grieving Mustafa in his own guarded way, began to show signs of favoring Selim. Hurrem encouraged this subtly, praising Selim's judgment, downplaying his weaknesses. She never openly criticized Bayezid, but she allowed doubts to settle in the Sultan's mind like dust on a treasured book. It was the same strategy she had used against Mustafa, though this time the stakes were even more personal. Now it was not a rival's son she maneuvered against, but her own flesh and blood. And here lay the paradox. The wisdom that had brought her from slave to queen was now a double-edged sword. Every lesson she gave her sons, in power, in politics, in survival, was a blade in their hands. And in the end, one of them would use it against the other. At night, alone in her chambers, Hurrem would think of the years ahead. She imagined Selim's ascension, her bloodline secure, her legacy untouchable. But she also imagined the bodies it would take to reach that moment. She had not escaped the cruelty of the harem's games. She had simply passed it on. As the months passed, the rivalry between Selim and Bayezid deepened. Cihangir's health continued to fail, and with it, his will to live. Hurrem's time was spent in constant motion, mediating disputes, strengthening Selim's alliances, quietly undermining Bayezid's. The shadow over the Ottoman court lengthened, and it was cast not by an enemy at the gates, but by the brothers within its walls. Soon, the empire would no longer be able to contain their conflict. The same tradition that had claimed Mustafa was stirring again, and this time, Hurrem would be forced to choose not just between her sons, but between her heart and her legacy. Beyond the gilded lattice of the harem, the empire was restless. The Janissaries, once the unshakable backbone of the Ottoman military, had begun to mutter openly in the barracks. They did not speak of rebellion, not yet, but their tone had shifted. The death of Mustafa still lingered in their minds, a wound they could not forgive. To them, it had not been the Sultan's will alone, it had been the will of her. In the provinces, trouble flared like brush fires. In the eastern lands, governors complained of short supplies and heavy taxes. In the Balkans, local leaders tested the limits of the empire's grip. Every piece of bad news carried with it the scent of vulnerability, and foreign powers could smell it from across the seas. In Venice, diplomats whispered over their wine. In Persia, the Shah's court weighed whether the Ottoman lion was beginning to limp. Even in distant European courts, the name of the Sultan's wife was spoken with fascination and disgust in equal measure. Hurrem Sultan, a woman risen from the slave market, now seemed to hold the empire's pulse in her hand. Inside the palace, her reach was felt in every corridor. But so, too, was the rising hatred. The Valide Sultan, Suleiman's mother, had grown wary. She had watched Hurrem's ascent with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, but now her doubt had hardened into something sharper. The old order of the harem had been broken, its balance disrupted. Hurrem did not just hold the Sultan's affection. She bent his ear in matters of law, war, and diplomacy. To the Valide Sultan, this was not merely unusual, it was dangerous. And then came the illnesses. A high-ranking court official, hale and hearty one day, was found sweating and pale the next, dead within the week. A favored concubine of the Sultan's youth collapsed suddenly at a feast, the laughter still on her lips. A governor visiting from the provinces complained of stomach pains after sharing a meal in the palace and never returned to his post. Some deaths were clearly natural, others less so. The court began to whisper of poison. They spoke of a slow, invisible sickness spreading through the ranks of the Sultan's advisors, a sickness that cleared the path for Hurrem's allies. Every vacancy seemed to be filled by someone loyal to her. To her enemies, she was no longer just ambitious. She was an infection at the heart of the empire. But Suleiman did not see it that way. To him, Hurrem remained his closest confidant, the one who shared his burdens when the weight of empire bent his shoulders. She listened without judgment when he spoke of failures on the battlefield, of rebellions that drained the treasury, of foreign threats pressing at the empire's borders. In her presence, he could speak freely without the posturing required before his viziers. He trusted her, perhaps more than any man in his council. This contradiction, the Sultan's devotion to her and the court's loathing of her, was becoming unbearable. It split the palace into factions, each watching the other with suspicion. Servants were caught between two worlds, the public loyalty demanded by the Sultan and the private contempt whispered in the kitchens. Eunuchs found themselves passing messages with double meanings, careful not to appear in one camp too openly. The air in the palace thickened with intrigue. Hurrem moved through it with her usual composure. She did not flinch when greetings were colder than they once were. She did not pause when conversations fell silent at her approach. In her eyes, every show of hostility was simply proof that her power was real, and real power was always hated. Still, she was not blind. She saw the tightening of the Valide Sultan circle, the way certain viziers exchanged glances in her presence. She knew that suspicion could turn into action with frightening speed. In response, she tightened her own web. She rewarded loyalty lavishly. Gifts of gold, fine fabrics, choice appointments. She kept the city's poor on her side with new charitable works, ensuring that her name was still spoken with gratitude in the streets, even as it was cursed in the court. And she made herself indispensable to Suleiman in the one arena where no one could replace her. the private sphere of his mind. She became the voice that helped him think through every decision, the ear that heard his doubts, the counsel that calmed his fears. But outside, the empire trembled. The Janissaries' restlessness was no longer confined to mutters in the barracks. They began to test their limits, delaying orders, grumbling about pay, questioning strategies. In distant provinces, rebellions flared into open conflict. The treasury was strained by the cost of putting them down. And through it all, the court kept returning to the same poisonous question. Was the empire's weakness the result of foreign enemies, or of the woman who now shared the Sultan's most guarded thoughts? Hurrem knew the danger of letting that question grow unchecked, but she also knew that in politics, the appearance of control could be as powerful as control itself. So she stood tall in public processions, her silks shimmering, her jewels blazing in the sunlight. She spoke warmly to foreign envoys, smiled at the Janissaries as she passed. It was a performance, one meant to project stability in a court that was anything but stable. Yet every step she took seemed to sharpen the knives waiting in the dark. The Valid Sultan, though aged, began to move more aggressively. She summoned allies, reminded them of the dangers of letting any one voice dominate the Sultan's mind. She pressed for appointments that would counterbalance Hurrem's influence, filling the court with men who owed their loyalty to the old order. It became a silent war. No armies, no banners, just the steady removal of pieces from the board. One day, a supporter of Hurrem would be reassigned to a distant province. Another day, a petition she championed would be quietly delayed. Hurrem understood the message, and she answered in kind. For every ally she lost, she gained another through charm, favors, or quiet threats. For every obstruction placed before her, she found a way around it. It was not a battle, to be won in a single strike, but a war of attrition, one she had been fighting since the day she first entered the palace gates. But the pressure was building. The Janissaries' murmurs were now demands. Provincial unrest was bleeding into the capital. The court was splitting in ways it had not in decades. And at the center of it all was the woman who, to some, was the empire's greatest strength, and to others, its most dangerous disease. And as the walls closed in, Hurrem would find that the deadliest threats were not the enemies she could see in the court, but the ones gathering beyond the palace gates, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Inside, the air is warm, but heavy. The opulent chambers that once rang with the bright sound of Hurrem's laughter now lie in a hush so deep it feels almost sacred. The air smells faintly of rosewater and bitter herbs, the medicine of the palace physicians. Beneath it lingers something else, the damp scent of linens that have been washed too often, too hastily, in the long weeks of her illness. Hurrem lies propped against embroidered pillows, her skin pale as the winter sky. The jewels that once blazed against her brow are gone. In their place is a simple silk headscarf. Yet her eyes, those unflinching, calculating eyes, remain sharp. Even bedridden, she rules. Messengers slip in and out, bowing low, carrying her words into the labyrinth of the palace. Loyal servants lean close to hear her instructions. Which audience to delay, which request to deny, which governor's letter must be answered at once. The pulse of the court still beats in rhythm with her will. But outside these walls, the air is shifting. Her son's rivalry has reached its boiling point. Selim and Bayezid no longer hide their hostility behind smiles. The court has split along fault lines, viziers and military commanders quietly aligning themselves with one prince or the other. The old rule looms over all of it. When the Sultan dies, only one son may live to inherit. Hurrem knows that her illness has come at the worst possible moment. A mother's presence can be a shield, but a dying mother's influence, that is a blade with only so much reach. Her enemies feel it too, those who have long chafed under her control, the valid sultan's remaining allies, the Janissary commanders who have never forgiven Mustafa's death, sense the opportunity in her weakness. They no longer hide their satisfaction when she fails to attend a council session. They whisper that the empire will breathe easier once she is gone. But Hurrem is not ready to relinquish the game. On the rare days when she can sit upright, she receives visitors in a chamber warmed by braziers and perfumed by amber incense. The light from the latticed windows falls across her face in delicate patterns, like the shadows of the web she has spent decades weaving. Her voice is softer now, but it still carries authority. She tells Salem which alliances to strengthen. She warns Bayezid, without naming names, of friends who may turn into executioners. She is still their mother, but she is also still their strategist. Suleiman visits often. He no longer walks with the easy stride of the young ruler who had once carried her into these chambers. His hair is white, his face lined, his frame bent slightly forward, the weight of age and grief pressing him down. When he sits beside her, he does not speak of politics. Instead, they talk in murmurs of their early years together. The gardens where she first made him laugh, the nights when they stayed awake until dawn, talking of worlds they had never seen. But the silences between them speak as loudly as the words. Outside, snow blankets the city. The narrow streets of Istanbul are muffled and slow. Even the sound of the ship bells from the harbor seems muted. The whole city feels as though it is waiting for something to end, or perhaps for something to begin. In the harem, the women tread lightly, their slippers making no sound on the carpets. The eunuchs speak in whispers. No one wants to be the one to disturb the fragile balance between life and death in the queen's chambers. As winter deepens, Hurrem's strength ebbs. Some days she sleeps for hours, waking only when the muezzin's call drifts faintly through the shutters. On other days, she forces herself to stay awake, dictating letters, making final arrangements. Her mind moves with the same clarity it always has, but her body refuses to obey. One afternoon, she asks for parchment and ink. Her hand trembles as she writes. Not love letters, not farewells, but final instructions. Which alliances to preserve, which debts to collect, which threats to crush swiftly before they can grow. She knows the palace will not honor her memory out of affection. It will honor her only out of fear, and she intends for that fear to outlive her. On her last night, the wind rises outside, rattling the wooden shutters. Snow sweeps across the Bosphorus in thin ghostly veils. Suleiman sits beside her bed, his hands folded over hers. For a long time, neither speaks. The candles burn low. The shadows on the walls stretch long and thin. At last, she opens her eyes fully and looks at him, not with the smile that once captured his heart, but with the unflinching gaze of a queen addressing her co-ruler. "Protect them," she whispers. "Our sons, our blood." It is not a plea, it is a command. The palace bells toll before dawn. The sound rolls across the snow-covered courtyards, echoing through the silent city. Within the harem, the women begin to wail softly, their voices carrying the ancient lament for a fallen queen. In the mosques, prayers are offered for Hurrem Sultan, consort, mother of princes, and, to many, the most powerful woman the empire has ever known. But outside the palace, the reactions are divided. Some mourn sincerely. Others hear the bells as the herald of a long-awaited end. For Suleiman, it is the closing of a chapter written across decades, a chapter of love and betrayal, of political triumph and personal loss. He has lost his partner in both passion and power. For the empire, it is the end of an era. And for her sons, it is the beginning of a final, merciless contest. One she had tried to shape, but could no longer control. Without Hurrem's hand to steady and or manipulate, the balance the game she mastered will turn in on itself. And the blood she fought to protect may soon be spilled by the very heirs she left behind. Her death left a space too large to fill. For decades, Hurrem had been the axis on which the inner workings of the Ottoman court turned. The unseen hand arranging alliances, soothing tensions, or igniting them when it suited her purpose. Without her, the palace felt unmoored. At first, the shift was subtle. Audiences delayed, decisions postponed, petitions left unanswered. But absence, in a place like Topkapi, does not remain neutral. It becomes a vacuum, and a vacuum draws in chaos. Her sons moved quickly to claim what she could no longer control. Selim, pliable, patient, groomed for the throne by his mother's careful design, now stood as the favored heir in Sulayman's weary eyes. Bayezid, fiery and independent, refused to step aside. What had been rivalry while Hurrem lived became open defiance in her absence. The two brothers began to gather their own factions, each promising loyalty and reward to those who would stand with them when the inevitable came. The court split down the middle. Viziers, governors, and military commanders made quiet choices, aligning themselves with one son or the other. The Janissaries, still haunted by Mustafa's death, eyed Bayezid with a dangerous mix of admiration and suspicion. Hurrem had always understood that the empire's tradition was as cruel as it was unspoken. Only one son may inherit, and the others must die. Now her own children moved toward that law like men walking a narrow bridge over a chasm, each knowing only one could reach the other side. The confrontation came sooner than anyone expected. Bayezid's defiance sharpened into action, a refusal to obey orders, a deliberate challenge to Selim's authority. Letters meant for the Sultan were intercepted. Messages between allies carried whispers of treachery. Selim, who had inherited his mother's patience, if not her cunning, understood that delay would only strengthen his brother. He moved carefully, positioning himself not as the aggressor, but as the dutiful son, loyal to their father's will. Sulayman, old and tired, made his choice. Bayezid was summoned, not to counsel, but to judgment. The charges were laid: rebellion, disobedience, betrayal. Whether they were entirely true mattered less than the fact that the Sultan believed them, or allowed himself to. The sentence was death. Bayezid met his end far from the city, strangled in the same manner as Mustafa. The silk cord tightened, and with it, the last barrier to Selim's uncontested succession fell away. The empire now had a new heir, but the crown he would inherit was cracked. Sulayman's reign, once a golden age, had been shadowed in its later years by blood spilled within his own family. The people whispered of a curse, that the death of Mustafa had poisoned the dynasty, and Hurrem's hand in that act had doomed her own sons to repeat the same fratricidal fate. Selim ascended after his father's death, but he ruled a court more fractured, an army less loyal, and a populace whose faith in the Sultanate's stability had begun to waver. In the streets of Istanbul, memory worked in paradoxes. Some remembered Hurrem as the saint of the poor, the woman whose mosques still gave bread to the hungry, whose fountains still poured clean water in the public squares. Mothers told their daughters that she had risen from nothing, from chains, to command the empire's most powerful man. Others remembered her as the serpent, the smiling architect of Mustafa's death, the poison in the veins of the court, the shadow that had turned brother against brother. In their telling, her beauty had been a mask, and her charity a cover for ambition that had cost the empire its unity. The mosques she built still stood, their domes gleaming in the sunlight, their courtyards filled with the faithful. But for those who hated her, every stone seemed stained with invisible blood. They said that no amount of incense could wash away the scent of what had been done to keep her sons safe. In the palace, life settled back into its old order. at least on the surface. The harem returned to the hierarchy that had existed before Hurrem had broken it. The Valide Sultan at the top, concubines beneath, all bound by the invisible chains of tradition. But beneath the veneer, the precedent had been set. Hurrem's life had proven something dangerous and unforgettable. A woman, if she possessed enough cunning, patience, and will, could rule an empire from behind a veil. She could bend its laws without breaking them, reshape its future without ever wearing a crown. This was her true legacy, and it frightened the men who inherited her world. From that point forward, every powerful woman in the harem would be measured against her shadow. Some would try to emulate her rise, others would suffer for being suspected of it. The term Haseki Sultan would forever carry the weight of her story. For the empire, her absence did not bring the peace her enemies had hoped for. Instead, it left a wound, deep, jagged, and unhealed. The politics she had mastered continued, but without her skill to balance them, they became cruder, more destructive. Selim would drink deeply of the cup she had placed in his hands, but he lacked the vision to wield it as she had. The empire under him would not rise. It would slowly, almost imperceptibly, begin to lean toward decline. And yet, in the quiet courtyards of the mosques she endowed, her name was still spoken with reverence. Old women would touch the carved marble, murmuring prayers for the soul of the woman who had given them food in their youth. Children played in the shade of her buildings, unaware of the storms that had been waged in the chambers where she once ruled. In this way, Hurrem remained two people at once, the saint and the serpent, the mother and the manipulator, the queen who had never worn a crown and yet had ruled more completely than many who did. Her story did not end with her death. It lived in the caution of viziers, in the suspicion of generals, in the whispered warnings passed to every new concubine entering the harem. It lived in the architecture of Istanbul, in the pages of foreign ambassadors' reports, in the bloodlines of the children she had fought to protect. And most of all, it lived in the knowledge that in the Ottoman court, power could be held in silence, and that the deadliest weapon was often a smile. But beyond the walls of Topkapi, time was moving. The empire would change, the throne would pass to new hands, and yet the ghost of Hurrem Sultan would remain, not just as a memory, but as a warning of what it costs to grasp power and what it costs to keep it. Centuries have passed since Hurrem Sultan walked these halls, yet her presence refuses to loosen its grip. History has not buried her. It has immortalized her. Her story has been written and rewritten, twisted, polished, and argued over in countless tongues. In modern Turkey, she lives on in dramas that stream into millions of homes. Her face reimagined by actresses draped in jewels. She inhabits novels where she is either heroine or villain, and history books where scholars still debate whether she saved the empire or helped doom it. To some, she is a symbol of female power in an age when women were meant to be silent. The slave who broke her chains, not by force but by wit, patience, and an unyielding will. She was the woman who bent an emperor's ear and held it for life, who rose from obscurity to shape the fate of one of the greatest empires in history. To others, she is the embodiment of manipulation, a schemer whose ambition cost lives and fractured the stability of the Ottoman dynasty, the woman who smiled as princes fell, who could wrap murder in silk and send it into the Sultan's hands disguised as wisdom. But perhaps the truth is that she was both. The paradox is what makes her unforgettable. She was the saint who built mosques that still feed the poor, and the serpent whose whispers led to executions that still stain the memory of the court. She was the loving mother who protected her sons with ferocity, and the political tactician who knew that for one to live, others had to die. Her marble tomb stands today in the courtyard of the Suleymaniye Mosque, only steps away from the resting place of Suleiman himself. The two lie side by side as they did in life, partners in love, in power, and in a reign that still draws both admiration and condemnation. The stone is pale, worn smooth by time, but the calligraphy carved into it remains crisp. Prayers for her soul, carved by the hand of an empire that, for all its whispers, still gave her the honors of a queen. Tourists pass through, their voices low. Some know her story, others simply see another beautiful tomb in the city of sultans. But the air in this place feels different, heavier, as if the stone remembers. Those who linger swear that even now, when the light shifts through the high windows, it can seem as though she is there, a figure in the corner of your vision, draped in emerald silk, a faint perfume of roses lingering where no flowers stand. In the halls of Topkapi, her life still breathes. Visitors wander through the imperial harem, tracing the tiled corridors where she once walked. They pause in the grand audience chambers, where she may have stood beside Suleiman, her voice threading through his council like a needle through cloth. Most do not notice the faint indentations in the marble floors where countless feet once passed, the marks of the women who served, obeyed, and conspired. Hurrem's footsteps are among them, though hers led further than any had dared to go. She endures because her story is more than the story of a queen. It is a warning, a legend, and a promise all at once. She proved that power is not always taken by the sword. Sometimes it is taken by the smile, the whisper, the hand resting lightly on the right shoulder at the right moment. Even now, in modern political debates, her name is invoked, sometimes as praise for bold, cunning leadership, sometimes as a curse for ruthless ambition. Her life has become a shorthand for influence that operates in the shadows. Every retelling reshapes her, yet the core remains the same. Hurrem Sultan is never just the slave girl from Ruthenia, never just the sultan's wife, never just the mother of princes. She is the thread that bound together, and sometimes strangled, the fabric of an empire. She is also the proof that history never belongs entirely to the victors or the vanquished. It belongs to those who can make themselves unforgettable. And that, above all, is what she achieved. Her reign ended centuries ago, yet she remains alive in the collective imagination, a figure of fascination, fury, and reluctant admiration. The harem she commanded has long since fallen silent, but her influence still hums in the walls. The empire she shaped has dissolved into history, yet her name has outlived it. For in every retelling, Hurrem smiles her knowing smile, the one that held both invitation and warning. Her hands invisible, but always at the throat of history. She is still the slave who became an empress, and she is the empress who never truly died. Final fade. The camera pulls back. From her tomb, the carved marble framed by the mosque's arch. Beyond it, the city spreads, the same skyline she once looked upon, minarets and domes glowing in the late afternoon light. The Bosphorus glitters, ships cutting across the same waters that brought her here in chains. The call to prayer rises again, just as it did in her lifetime. The sound swells, echoing over the city, over the centuries, over the story of the woman who mastered both love and power, and whose shadow will never leave the heart of Istanbul.